Comrades, the world feels heavy not because humanity is weak, but because the weight of the world has been placed upon the backs of the many, so that the few may walk lightly upon its surface. You are told this heaviness is natural. You are told inequality is inevitable. You are told that poverty is failure, that wealth is virtue, that the order of things is fixed like the laws of nature. But I say to you, this weight was engineered, this burden was designed, and this system was built by human hands, and therefore can be unbuilt by human hands. From the first moment society divided itself into classes, history ceased to be a story of harmony and became a record of struggle. Every age, beneath its flags and prayers and slogans, has concealed the same conflict, those who labour and those who appropriate the fruits of that labour. The modern world, despite its machines and markets, has not abolished this conflict. It has sharpened it. Capitalism did not free humanity from chains, it refined them. The worker enters the factory, the office, the mine, believing they sell their labour freely. Yet what freedom is this, when survival itself is for sale? When the choice is not between dignity and exploitation, but between exploitation and starvation? Labour becomes a commodity, and the worker becomes an appendage to production, valued only for what can be extracted and discarded when no longer profitable. Here lies the great deception of our age, that exploitation wears the mask of opportunity. The capitalist does not create wealth alone. Wealth is born from collective labour, yet it is privately seized. The many produce, the few possess. The worker builds cities yet owns no shelter, produces abundance yet lives in scarcity, creates value yet remains undervalued. This is not accident. It is the logic of capital. Capital accumulates not because it is virtuous, but because it absorbs unpaid labour. Profit is not reward, it is surplus stolen from the working class, and the greater the profit, the deeper the theft. You feel the weight of the world because it is resting upon your shoulders while others profit from your exhaustion. Capitalism fragments humanity. It teaches workers to compete against one another rather than recognize their shared condition. It divides by nation, race, religion, gender, anything to prevent the most dangerous realization of all, that the working class is one class, with one enemy and one historical mission. The ruling class fears nothing more than organized consciousness. They fear the moment when workers cease to see themselves as isolated individuals and begin to see themselves as a collective force. They fear solidarity because solidarity transforms labour from a resource into a power. When workers unite, the machinery of exploitation begins to tremble. Yet the system trains obedience from childhood. It disciplines bodies with schedules, minds with ideology, and spirits with fear. It teaches resignation as wisdom and submission as realism. It tells the oppressed to be patient, to wait, to endure, while capital never waits, never rests, never shows mercy. But history does not move forward through patience. History moves forward through struggle. Every right enjoyed today was once illegal. Every freedom was once called dangerous. The ruling class has never surrendered power willingly. It has only conceded when confronted by organized resistance. Progress is not gifted from above, it is seized from below. Do not believe the lie that the system can be humanized while its foundations remain intact. Exploitation cannot be reformed out of existence. A system built on inequality cannot deliver equality. As long as production serves profit rather than human need, suffering will be reproduced endlessly, no matter how polished the rhetoric becomes. The task before us is not charity, but transformation, not reform alone, but revolution in consciousness and structure. The working class must recognize itself as the true producer of all wealth and the rightful architect of society. Labour must no longer serve capital. Capital must be abolished as a ruling force. Production must be organized collectively for collective benefit. The economy must cease to be a battlefield and become a shared endeavour. This is not chaos, this is rationality reclaimed, a society organized around human need rather than private profit is not utopian, it is the logical conclusion of history's contradictions. Capitalism creates the conditions for its own dissolution by concentrating workers, sharpening inequality, and exposing the injustice at its core. The system digs its own grave with every crisis it produces. Comrades, the world feels heavy because it has been carried by the wrong people for too long. Let the weight shift. Let the producers become the decision makers. Let labor reclaim its dignity, its power, its future. You have nothing to lose but the chains that exhaust you, silence you, and drain your life for another's wealth. You have a world to win, not someday, not abstractly, but through conscious, organized struggle. History is not finished, the struggle is not over, and the working class is not powerless. It is only unfinished. Rise, organize, and remember. The world will feel lighter the moment it is no longer built on unequal shoulders. Society's inequality is not an accident, nor is it a natural occurrence embedded in the rhythms of human life. It is the product of deliberate design, constructed and maintained to serve the interests of a select few while subordinating the majority. From the earliest formations of structured society, humans have divided themselves into classes, not merely as a reflection of skill or merit, but as a means to control resources, labor, and power. This division is visible in the structures that govern our lives, in the laws that favor ownership over labor, and in the cultural narratives that normalize hierarchy and privilege. The inequalities we witness daily, the disproportionate distribution of wealth, the inaccessibility of healthcare, the unequal quality of education, and the stark contrasts in living conditions, are not outcomes of chance or the result of natural talent alone. They are manifestations of a system that prioritizes accumulation over fairness, exploitation over equity, and profit over human need. The framework of society is such that the rich acquire and maintain their wealth not merely because they are industrious, but because the system is organized to allow them to appropriate the labor and resources of the majority while insulating themselves from the risks and hardships that the majority endures. The infrastructures that shape daily life, housing markets, financial institutions, labor laws, political representation, are embedded with mechanisms that reinforce advantage for the privileged while imposing constraints on the marginalized. Consider the laborer who produces goods or services. The value they create is systematically extracted and converted into profit, which is rarely, if ever, proportionally returned. Meanwhile, those who control the means of production and capital accumulate not because they contribute to the labor itself, but because they own the structures and frameworks through which labor operates. This engineered inequality becomes self-reinforcing. Wealth begets wealth, influence begets influence, and opportunities become increasingly stratified. Education, often held as the gateway to advancement, is itself unequal. Access to quality schooling depends on geographic location, social status, and financial capacity. Healthcare, similarly, is not universally accessible, creating disparities in longevity and quality of life that correlate directly with economic status. The cultural narratives and ideologies promoted within society work to legitimize these disparities, presenting them as natural outcomes of merit, effort, or individual responsibility, when in reality they are maintained through systemic design. Those at the top cultivate beliefs that normalize hierarchy and discourage questioning, suggesting that success is a product of inherent ability and failure, the result of personal inadequacy, rather than a reflection of structural advantage or systemic barriers. Political systems, too, are often aligned with the interests of the elite, creating policies that reinforce wealth concentration, deregulate exploitation, and marginalize dissent. Tax structures, lobbying influence, and campaign financing often ensure that laws favor property owners, capital holders, and corporate interests over the collective well-being. Even social norms, the unspoken rules by which communities operate, are shaped in ways that sustain inequality. Gender, race, and cultural biases intersect with economic stratification to further entrench disadvantage, producing compounded barriers for those already marginalized. The laborer, the migrant, the woman, the person of color, the underprivileged student, each encounters a society engineered to limit upward mobility while amplifying obstacles. Inequality is thus not merely the result of individual misfortune or poor decision-making, but a product of systematic construction. Every institution, every market, and every legal framework contributes to a web of disparity that benefits the few at the expense of the many. The mechanisms of inequality are subtle yet pervasive. Wage structures are designed to extract maximum effort at minimal cost, while benefits, security, and social protections are often scarce or tied to conditions of privilege. Credit systems favor those with existing wealth, enabling them to leverage capital while excluding others from opportunity. Property laws enshrine ownership in ways that accumulate advantage across generations, allowing inequality to persist and even widen over time. Media and culture, likewise, play a role in shaping perceptions, presenting the social hierarchy as inevitable, masking systemic exploitation, and framing dissent as impractical or radical. In every sphere, from the economic to the social to the political, society is constructed to reproduce inequality, ensuring that the burdens of survival, labor, and risk fall disproportionately on those least able to bear them, while the privileges, securities, and luxuries of life are hoarded by the few. The uneven distribution of opportunity and reward is not a reflection of natural order, nor is it a spontaneous outcome of human interaction. It is the deliberate product of systems, laws, and institutions designed to concentrate wealth, power, and influence, ensuring that the majority remains subservient and the minority remains dominant. Capitalism is not a neutral system of exchange or a benign framework for organizing economic activity. It is a structure that thrives precisely because it exploits labor. At the heart of capitalism lies a contradiction between the value created by workers and the profits accumulated by owners of capital. Every good produced, every service rendered, every innovation implemented in society carries within it the imprint of labor, the effort, skill, and time of the working individual. Yet under capitalism, the benefits of this labor are rarely returned to the laborer in proportion to their contribution. The capitalist system is designed to extract surplus value from work, to appropriate the difference between what workers are paid and the value their labor generates, and to convert that surplus into profit for owners and investors. This extraction is not incidental, it is fundamental to the operation of the system. Without the unpaid labor of the many, capital cannot grow and wealth cannot accumulate. The capitalist does not merely buy labor as a service, but commodifies it, transforming human effort into a mechanism for wealth generation that enriches one class at the expense of another. This exploitation is embedded in wage labor, where the worker sells their time to survive, yet the remuneration they receive rarely reflects the total value produced. A factory worker assembling goods or a clerk processing transactions contributes far more value than the wages they receive. The difference, or surplus, is captured by those who control production, creating a system in which the laborer produces wealth but is barred from owning the fruits of their work. The consequences of this system are multifaceted. Economically, it ensures the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a few, while the majority are compelled to continue laboring to meet basic needs. Socially, it entrenches hierarchies, making inequality appear natural or inevitable, while masking the structural forces that produce it. Psychologically, it normalizes the idea that survival requires submission, fostering dependence on a system that simultaneously exploits and subjugates. Capitalism is dynamic in its methods of exploitation. It adapts to circumstances, seeking ever more efficient ways to extract labor while minimizing costs. The introduction of machinery, technology, and automation is often framed as progress or liberation for the worker, yet it frequently functions to intensify exploitation. By increasing productivity without proportionally increasing wages, the system intensifies the extraction of surplus value. The worker produces more in the same or less time, but the benefits accrue to capital rather than to labor. Even the apparent freedom of choice under capitalism, the ability to enter markets, to switch jobs, or to seek entrepreneurship, is constrained by systemic pressures. Economic necessity forces workers to sell their labor to survive, creating a dependence that limits genuine autonomy. In this way, capitalism disguises exploitation as opportunity, presenting the system as fair or meritocratic, while ensuring that inequality persists and deepens. Furthermore, capitalism's global expansion amplifies exploitation by relocating labor where costs are lower and protections weaker. Workers in developing countries often endure grueling conditions, long hours, and minimal compensation to produce goods consumed in wealthier nations. The system thrives on these inequalities, turning human labor into a global commodity whose value is determined not by the needs of workers but by the demands of capital accumulation. The ideological component of capitalism further perpetuates exploitation. Education, media, and culture are leveraged to justify disparities in wealth and opportunity, portraying labor as a choice rather than a necessity, poverty as failure rather than a structural outcome, and capital accumulation as the reward of hard work rather than the product of appropriated labor. Workers are pitted against one another, encouraged to compete for limited opportunities rather than recognizing their collective position within the economic hierarchy. Labor unions, strikes, and collective bargaining are often resisted, undermined, or co-opted because organized labor represents a direct challenge to the mechanisms of surplus extraction. When workers unite, the system's capacity to exploit diminishes, which is why capital often seeks to fragment labor along lines of nationality, race, gender, and skill. Capitalism also monetizes dependency, transforming basic human necessities, housing, healthcare, education, food, into markets that extract additional surplus value. The worker is compelled to spend the wages earned through exploitation to meet essential needs, thereby feeding the same system that produces their oppression. Even leisure and culture are commodified, turning human desire and creativity into additional instruments of accumulation. In essence, the entire structure of capitalism revolves around the extraction of labor. Profit is not an incidental. It is the outcome of a system meticulously organized to appropriate the results of human effort. Every policy, every law, every market mechanism functions to preserve the power of capital and perpetuate the subjugation of labor. Inequalities are not anomalies to be corrected, but structural imperatives necessary for the continued growth and stability of the system. The success of capitalism is inseparable from the exploitation of labor, and understanding this dynamic is essential for anyone seeking to comprehend the fundamental nature of economic relations in a society dominated by private ownership and profit-driven production. Workers create wealth, yet they are systematically denied its ownership, and this denial lies at the heart of the economic and social structures that govern modern society. Every product, service, innovation, and infrastructure that sustains daily life is born from human labor, yet the people who contribute their time, skill, and effort are rarely recognized as the rightful owners of the value they generate. The machinery, the offices, the factories, the farms, and the digital platforms that shape modern life depend entirely on the labor of countless individuals. Yet the rewards of their work are appropriated by those who control capital, property, and the means of production. This fundamental disconnection between creation and ownership produces inequality that is both profound and persistent, manifesting in disparities of income, wealth, opportunity, and influence. Ownership is not merely a legal or abstract concept, it confers power, autonomy, and security. To deny workers ownership of the wealth they generate is to deny them the capacity to shape their own lives and futures. While workers provide the material basis for society, they remain subordinate, dependent on wages that are often insufficient to meet their basic needs, while the profits derived from their labor accumulate in the hands of a minority. The capitalist system justifies this arrangement through ideology, claiming that ownership is earned by capital, management, or entrepreneurship, rather than recognizing that capital itself produces nothing without labor. Machinery, technology, and financial instruments may facilitate production, but they are inert and powerless without the human effort that animates them. The worker, therefore, is the true source of wealth, yet the structures of society assign them neither authority nor claim over the value they create. This denial of ownership extends beyond wages into broader aspects of life. Housing, healthcare, education, and access to basic necessities are tied to participation in the wage system, forcing workers to spend the products of their own labor to survive. In effect, they work to sustain themselves while simultaneously generating wealth for others. This creates a cycle of dependence and subordination, in which the worker's efforts are essential yet perpetually undervalued and appropriated. Intergenerationally, the denial of ownership compounds inequality. Families without access to capital or property are excluded from opportunities for wealth accumulation, while those who inherit ownership maintain and expand their advantage. The worker's contribution to society, through labor that builds cities, produces food, advances technology, and sustains social institutions, remains alienated, separated from the benefits of its existence. The ideological apparatus of society reinforces this alienation by framing ownership as a reward for risk, investment, or ingenuity, masking the fundamental truth that the worker provides the essential substance of all wealth. Education, media, and cultural narratives often present the accumulation of capital as an achievement divorced from exploitation, portraying workers' dependence on wages as natural and inevitable. The denial of ownership is also structural within corporations and economic institutions. Workers may generate immense value through their labor, yet corporate profits, stock ownership, and decision-making power remain concentrated in the hands of shareholders and executives who contribute little to the production process. Even cooperative or ostensibly democratic enterprises often reproduce patterns of disparity, as access to meaningful ownership and control is limited by barriers of capital, legal structures, and social hierarchies. Globalization amplifies the denial of ownership by relocating production to regions where labor is cheapest and protections are weakest, allowing multinational corporations to extract maximum value while minimizing responsibility to those who produce it. Workers around the world are linked by the same system. They create wealth on a scale unimaginable to previous generations, yet the vast majority remains unable to claim that wealth for themselves, instead providing it to distant owners whose connection to the labor performed is often abstract and indirect. The denial of ownership has profound social and psychological effects, shaping perceptions of self-worth, agency, and possibility. When workers cannot claim the value they produce, they are rendered passive in decisions that govern their lives, subject to the priorities and whims of those who control capital. This diminishes the sense of individual and collective empowerment, reinforcing dependence and eroding the capacity for organized action. Strikes, labor movements, and collective bargaining arise precisely to challenge this denial, attempting to assert a claim on the wealth produced and to transform the relationship between labor and ownership. Yet these struggles are continually contested, suppressed, or co-opted, illustrating the entrenched power of those who benefit from maintaining the status quo. The structural mechanisms that deny ownership are deliberate and systemic, embedded in laws, institutions, financial practices, and cultural narratives. Property rights, intellectual property, corporate charters, tax policies, and investment structures collectively ensure that wealth flows from the laborer to the owner, rather than being equitably shared. Even technological advances, which have the potential to democratize production and distribution, are harnessed in ways that reinforce existing ownership hierarchies, concentrating wealth in the hands of those who already control capital. Ultimately, the worker is the foundation of society, the creator of wealth, and the source of progress, yet their exclusion from ownership ensures that the rewards of their labor serve the interests of others. This separation of creation and control produces profound inequality, alienation, and injustice, as the very people who sustain society are systematically denied the authority, benefits, and dignity that should naturally accompany their contribution. Division weakens the working class, while unity creates power, and this principle lies at the very core of understanding social and economic struggle. The working class, despite being the source of all wealth, is often fragmented by design, manipulated into perceiving one another as competitors rather than allies. Capitalism thrives not only through the extraction of labor, but also through the deliberate cultivation of division among those whose collective strength could challenge exploitation. By emphasizing differences of nationality, ethnicity, gender, religion, or skill, the system prevents workers from recognizing the commonality of their experience, the shared subjugation to capital, the dependence on wages for survival, and the systematic denial of control over the wealth they create. When workers are divided, they compete for limited opportunities, whether in employment, housing, or access to social services, and these competitions obscure the broader structures of power that exploit them collectively. Division fosters mistrust, resentment, and isolation, creating an environment in which individual grievances are addressed only superficially, if at all, and the larger patterns of exploitation remain intact. Historical evidence demonstrates that when workers are pitted against each other, whether through the promise of higher wages for some or the threat of unemployment for others, the result is stagnation and vulnerability. Strikes are broken, demands for justice are weakened, and the capitalist class consolidates power while the workers expend energy on intra-class conflicts. Conversely, unity transforms the working class from a collection of isolated individuals into a collective force capable of exerting influence over production, politics, and social norms. Unity enables workers to coordinate action, share resources, and demand recognition not as isolated voices, but as a coherent body with common interests. When workers organize, they reclaim agency over their labor and create leverage to negotiate conditions, wages, and rights that reflect the value they produce. Labor movements, trade unions, and collective campaigns throughout history exemplify the power of unity, demonstrating that coordinated action can achieve reforms, secure protections, and challenge entrenched hierarchies. The very capacity of capital to extract surplus value relies on the fragmentation of workers, and whenever unity emerges, the system responds with resistance, legislation to restrict organizing, propaganda to foster division, and mechanisms to pit one group against another. Yet unity is not merely a tactical advantage, it is a necessary condition for transformative change. The social, political and economic structures that reproduce inequality are resilient precisely because they exploit division. Only through solidarity can the working class challenge these structures at their core, asserting control over production, representation and the distribution of wealth. Moreover, unity fosters consciousness. When workers recognize themselves as part of a larger collective with shared interests, they begin to understand the systemic nature of their oppression. Individual suffering transforms into political awareness, and isolated struggles coalesce into movements capable of shaping society. Awareness, commonality strengthens resolve, deepens understanding, and encourages strategic action rather than reactive responses. Division, in contrast, fosters false consciousness, where workers internalize ideologies that frame inequality as natural, competition as virtuous, and solidarity as impossible or undesirable. By cultivating suspicion and prioritizing differences over shared conditions, the ruling class ensures that the potential power of the many is neutralized before it can manifest. Unity, therefore, is both defensive and offensive. It protects workers from exploitation by creating collective bargaining power, mutual support networks, and political representation, while also enabling proactive strategies to challenge and transform systems of oppression. The shared experience of labor, when recognized collectively, becomes a source of leverage. When workers understand that their labor is indispensable, that production halts without their effort, and that the wealth of society is generated by their hands, they can wield this knowledge to assert influence, demand justice, and restructure relationships of power. Furthermore, unity fosters resilience. Fragmented workers are vulnerable to economic shocks, layoffs, and crises, as they lack the coordination and solidarity to respond effectively. United workers, on the other hand, can organize mutual aid, defend communities, and maintain pressure on institutions to uphold rights and protections. Solidarity strengthens morale, builds networks of support, and sustains long-term campaigns for change that isolated efforts could never achieve alone. Cultural and ideological forces often attempt to undermine unity, promoting narrow types of individualism, meritocracy, or competition that obscure structural exploitation. Education, media, and social norms are leveraged to highlight differences rather than commonalities, to celebrate isolated success while ignoring systemic patterns, and to reward compliance with division. Yet the inherent strength of the working class lies precisely in its numbers, its indispensability to production, and its potential for coordinated action. Recognizing this potential is the first step toward building solidarity and reclaiming power. Division diminishes potential and sustains exploitation, while unity amplifies potential and creates conditions for justice. The collective consciousness, organization, and coordinated action of the working class are therefore not merely desirable. They are essential for confronting inequality, demanding fair treatment, and reshaping society to reflect the value and dignity of labor. Collective organization is the path to social transformation, for no meaningful change in society has ever been achieved by isolated individuals acting alone. The structures of oppression and exploitation are vast, entrenched, and maintained by coordinated interests that span economics, politics, and culture, and they cannot be dismantled through sporadic action or passive discontent. Social transformation requires a deliberate, conscious, and unified effort in which those most affected by injustice come together to articulate their shared interests, organize strategies, and mobilize their collective power. The power of collective organization lies not only in numbers but in coordination, strategy, and shared vision, allowing disparate struggles to coalesce into a coherent force capable of confronting entrenched hierarchies. History provides countless examples of how organized groups of workers, peasants, and marginalized communities have achieved reforms and shifts in social structure that would have been impossible through individual effort alone. When people unite around common objectives, pooling knowledge, resources, and energy, they can disrupt systems that rely on division and passivity to maintain control. Collective organization transforms labor into leverage, voice into influence, and protest into actionable pressure. In the absence of organization, even the most grievous exploitation is often tolerated or accepted as inevitable, as isolated complaints lack the capacity to challenge the broader machinery of power. Systems of oppression, whether economic, political, or social, are maintained through coordination, rules, and institutional enforcement, and they respond to threats in kind. Only through the conscious application of collective force can these systems be confronted effectively. Organization also enables the sharing of knowledge and experience, fostering awareness of the mechanisms of exploitation and the ways in which power operates. When individuals act alone, they may perceive injustice as personal misfortune or as an unchangeable feature of society, but within a collective, patterns of structural inequality become visible and strategic responses become possible. This awareness is both empowering and necessary for transformation, as it provides a foundation upon which action can be coordinated and sustained. Collective organization is not merely a tactic, it is a process of cultivating solidarity and consciousness, building relationships of trust, and developing the capacity to act in concert. It allows for the creation of institutions and networks that endure beyond immediate struggles, providing the infrastructure for long-term campaigns aimed at systemic change. Political movements, labor unions, cooperative enterprises, and social organizations exemplify how organized groups can negotiate, resist, and propose alternatives to existing structures, asserting influence where individual efforts would fail. Furthermore, collective organization amplifies the moral and social legitimacy of demands for change. When a society witnesses coordinated action by those who bear the brunt of injustice, it becomes increasingly difficult for ruling classes or institutions to dismiss grievances as isolated or marginal. Collective pressure can compel recognition, negotiation, and even concessions, gradually shifting power toward those who have been historically marginalized. Organization also serves as a protective mechanism, offering mutual support, security, and resilience in the face of repression. The forces of the status quo rarely yield power without resistance, and isolated actors are vulnerable to intimidation, co-optation, or suppression. In contrast, organized communities can resist these pressures collectively, sustaining struggle over time and developing adaptive strategies that ensure persistence and effectiveness. Social transformation achieved through collective organization is fundamentally rooted in the principle that power is relational, and that those who control institutions, resources, and capital rely on the labor and consent of the majority. By organizing collectively, those whose labor and participation sustain society can assert influence, challenge authority, and restructure relationships to align with principles of equity, justice, and human dignity. Collective organization enables strategic deployment of resources, coordinated action, and the creation of alternatives to exploitative systems. Whether through strikes, protests, political campaigns, cooperative ventures, or educational initiatives, organized action channels energy into methods capable of producing measurable change. It also allows movements to adapt, innovate, and respond to new challenges, maintaining momentum in ways that individual action alone cannot achieve. Beyond practical coordination, collective organization fosters a sense of shared purpose and identity, creating communities bound by common struggle and vision. This social cohesion strengthens morale, builds resilience, and cultivates the belief that transformation is possible, even in the face of entrenched and systemic barriers. When individuals recognize that they are part of a larger collective with shared objectives, fear and isolation diminish, and confidence and initiative grow. Collective organization is thus the mechanism through which awareness becomes power, and power becomes change. It transforms individual grievances into societal challenges, turning disparate experiences of oppression into unified campaigns for justice. By building structures of coordination, solidarity, and shared purpose, the oppressed gain the ability to reshape institutions, redistribute resources, and redefine social norms, laying the foundation for enduring transformation. The path to social change is therefore inseparable from the process of organization, and the capacity of communities to act collectively determines the extent to which oppression, inequality, and exploitation can be confronted and ultimately dismantled. The world feels heavy because it was built on unequal shoulders, and this weight will not lift itself. Inequality is not natural, it is engineered. Capitalism thrives on the exploitation of labor. Workers create wealth yet are denied its ownership. Division weakens the working class, while unity creates power, and only through collective organization can meaningful social transformation occur. The structures that oppress, divide, and exploit us are deliberate, maintained by systems that extract our labor, fragment our communities, and conceal our collective strength. But within this reality lies the potential for change, the recognition that the working class is the source of all wealth, the indispensable force without which society could not function, and the collective power capable of reshaping its own destiny. By uniting, organizing, and reclaiming ownership over our labor, we assert not only our rights but our humanity. The struggle is not abstract, it is immediate, concrete, and inescapable. The weight of oppression is heavy, but when the many stand together, conscious of their shared strength and purpose, the foundations of inequality can be challenged, overturned, and rebuilt on principles of justice, equity, and human dignity. The future belongs to those who refuse to accept exploitation, who refuse to be divided, and who rise collectively to claim the world that has always been theirs to shape.